going to talk about secret invasion of alien species. If you had the opportunity to watch my intro video, you could think that we're going to talk about aliens, like space aliens. But I have to, well, I hope I will not disappoint you with today's lesson, because the topic will be quite different. Well, again, for those who don't know me yet, my name is Wielgopolan. I work in the Institute of Geophysics, Polish Academy of Sciences. And today's topic, like I said, is invasive species, or sometimes called, not totally correctly, exotic species, alien species, and so on and so on. So let's start with what are they? Well, invasive species, they may not sound so much threatening, but they are true invaders. They may seem less threatening than a possible invasion from space, but actually they are very, very threatening. They can be large, they can be small, but they all, or almost all, have devastating effects on wildlife. In fact, we use this term to describe non-native species. That means that species that are non-native to a certain ecosystem. And this is a very important thing, that some species that might be very common and very even useful, or not harmful in a certain ecosystem, may become an invasive species in another ecosystem. For example, a bird you may know, a starling. In Poland or in Europe in general, it's quite common and it's well known and doesn't do any harm, but in some other ecosystems it is very, very harmful. So first of all, they are not indigenous, so they're not native to the system or a particular area, and usually they bring great economic, environmental harm to this new area, and that means that we need to make a division that not all non-native species are actually invasive. For example, most of the food crops grown, for example, in the United States, but not only in the United States, including like wheat, like tomatoes, like rice, were not native to the regions, but we are really glad that they're not now quite common. So when we think about invasive species, we might think about something quite large, but actually it can be any kind of living organism, like an amphibian, a plant, an insect, a fish, or fungus, or even bacteria, or even diseases, or even non-adult forms of organisms like seeds or eggs. And they don't need to come from another country or another continent. Sometimes it's another region, even a very close region of the same continent. So here is an example of some aquatic, some organisms that are non-native and are new to some aquatic systems. We'll talk later about maybe about the carp and about the zebra mussel in particular. So, the first thing I want you to remember is that globally, they are considered by scientists the second most important threat to biodiversity. The first one is considered to be habitat loss, and the second one is are invasive species. And approximately 42% of threatened or endangered species are considered to be at risk of extinction because of invasive species. So this is a really serious. Everyone is talking about climate change as a great threat to biodiversity, causing biodiversity loss, but in fact, invasive species are equally or even more dangerous. So in certain areas, you can spot those warnings, like invasive species alert even. So if they're non-native, so how is it's possible that they cross those very long distances. How do they arrive to their new destinations? Well, there are several possible pathways, very interesting ones actually. There is first there is accidental introduction. Maybe you must have heard of some diseases or some organisms brought by transport of food, in commerce, in tourism, because of traveling. So invasive species act like hitchhikers. So they're unintentionally transported as hitchhikers in railways, by ships in particular, to new sites, or on people, on tourists, on their clothes, on some products. And another very prominent pathway and less known is trade, and trade in wood in particular, wood and wood products. And so this is what happened as an accidental introduction. Sometimes they're introduced on purpose, and there are two types of introduction on purpose. First, there are some species that were introduced because they were thought to be a miraculous food for stock animals to fight some pests, and they went out of control, and now they became invasive species. Sometimes they were even thought to be able to prevent some phenomena like erosion, etc. But they actually went out of control. And the other one is when people didn't actually want to introduce those species into the environment, they just brought them for farming, like American mink. Like American mink, for example, that is farmed for furs, and it made a range, great expansion in Europe. It was farmed for its fur, of course, but many of them escaped those farms and became a very dangerous invasive species, altering ecosystems. And another third way is a so-called natural way. It means that humans do not directly transport them, but still we have some influence on their distribution, because I already mentioned climate change, and I will mention it a couple of times today. The conditions are changing, and this causes the spreading of some species, and their range is widening. First, because there are no limits, like it used to be very cold in certain area, or there was a lot of ice. Now it's ice-free, and it's warmer, so there's no natural climatic limit. This is one case, and in another case, animals that are used to cold temperatures are going north and north and more north or south towards poles in general, searching for lower temperatures, for the conditions like before climate change. So there are some examples. I already mentioned American mink, and American mink is a very, very dangerous species. Well, it's not dangerous for humans, but it's a very dangerous predator, and it's causing lots of harm in ecosystems. So they were escaping farms where they were farmed for fur. So it's like kind of a revenge of nature. Here we can see a very beautiful, it seems beautiful insect. It's emerald ash borer that was brought, especially to the US, with wood, especially with poor quality firewood. That means wood designed for fire. And now it's destroying forests, like in Georgia, for example. Here you can see it's quite disgusting. It's a citrus codling moth. It's transported in oranges and is able to destroy some orange fruit plantations in general. And so coming back to this emerald ash borer, here is a campaign against buying exotic wood for fire. You should buy it where you burn it to avoid bringing those exotic insects into ecosystems. Here we can see a cane toad. Actually, cane toad was brought to Australia in 1930s, and it was it was designed to fight some pests, but actually it also went out of control and didn't help at all. Well, it did help fighting pests, but the damage it caused is much larger. So I promised I would mention climate change, and I am, because climate change and invasive species are called a killer or vicious duo or a deadly duo. Why is that? So there are some examples, for example, of the spread of invasive species that are linked to climate change. And that means lots of types of species like diseases and so on that are very costly. So they are spread because of climate change, because of the temperature is rising, etc., etc. And but it's a kind of a vicious circle. So climate change is opening new paths for new paths in transportation. Like I said, if Arctic Ocean is ice-free, then there is a new path in transportation, new paths of shipping that brings lots of invasive species. No climatic borders, so animals that are not used to very harsh Arctic conditions, Arctic, for example, conditions, are able to live there in more northern areas. But actually, it's a vicious circle. It's a positive feedback loop, like I said, because invasive species themselves are also strengthening climate change effects for many reasons. Because, for example, there's this. It's a quite complicated name, Miconia calvescens. It's an invasive tree species, and it's spreading because of climate change. But it is also causing the climate change effects to be much more harmful, because it increases the risk of landslides because of high rainfall. So high rainfall is also an effect of climate change, and this invasion of Miconia calvescens is causing landslides to be more likely. So, like I said, it's a vicious killing duo, climate change and invasive species. But what is the key to their success? Why are invasive species so successful? Why do they survive in those new environments that they did not, where they were not present before? Well, there are several factors. I would like to start with this one, with wide range of tolerance. Wide range of tolerance is a very important feature of those organisms that are able to invade other ecosystems, because they have a very wide, for example, they're not very specialized in food. They can eat lots of different types of insects, for example. They do not need a very specific pH range or oxygen range, and so, or temperature, and so on and so on. So they are able to adapt to wide range of tolerance, most likely better than native species, and they are they're able to reproduce really quickly. And when they enter this new environment, it's very often that their population is not controlled, is not limited in natural ways by diseases or predators, because they often do not have natural predators in those new environments, and no diseases that limit their population. So this is the key to their success, mostly. And another question is, why are they so bad? Why are we so afraid of invasive organisms? Well, they impact ecosystems in many ways that are described, but these are only some examples of how they alter ecosystem and how they're destroy them in many ways. So they're introducing new pathogens, so the spread of diseases. They're changing ecosystem conditions in many ways. I already mentioned that they can support landslides, they can change pH, they can change, for example, they can change content of oxygen in water. It's anoxia that is mentioned here. One of the most important factors is that they alter food web because they're new predators, if we're talking about animals, of course, because you remember that they're not only animals, they can be plants as well. But so they may predate, they may simply kill and eat the animals that were native, so their population of native organisms is endangered. But it's not only killing them and eating, it's also competition in the same ecological niche. So they're also very effective in competing for resources. So they act in many ways, and here's an example of a fox, of a red fox, that is one of the most well-known invasive species in many ecosystems. Of course, for example, in Poland, it's quite common. It's not that dangerous. It's even well adapted to near urban regions. They find some trash and very well adapted to living nearby humans. But in some ecosystems, they can be really harmful, and not only because they for example, they hunt this animal, squirrel, but actually by competing and by altering food webs. So they share a similar diet with the squirrel, so they eat more or less the same things, but fox has a wider range of tolerance, so has a greater choice of food, we might say. So it competes with this quail. So this fundamental niche is similar, but fox is more efficient, we might say. So this niche of quail is shrinking, and this fox is expanding more and more, and fox populations is growing, and quail population is in decline because fox is eating grasshoppers and dragonflies that quail would also like to eat, simply saying. Those effects are both short-term and long-term effects. And here's an example of marine, or rather aquatic, invasive species. You can mark it. Its rapid reproduction is always very, very well known, a very important feature of invasive or organisms. They reduce food supply, but also they change. Remember, I told you that they change environmental conditions. They change microorganism flora. Some fish that are invading, for example, Great Lakes, but other lakes or freshwater or oceans too, they not only take food from native species, and so they die out, as native species die out of starvation. They also overpopulate water, and the water quality is decreasing because more and more species are dying out. And as a consequence, it also has direct economic consequences for humans, that it is a disruption of fisheries and for fishermen. So it all affects us economically, not only environmentally. There are lots of famous invasions, and I'd like to mention this one, or actually two examples, just to show you that our beloved pets, cats, are terrible invaders. invaders. I have a cat myself, so I'm a cat person, but I never let my cat roam and run free. Actually, when we let our cats run free, it's not only danger to them because they can be run by cars, etc., but it's also a great and often underestimated risk to the environment. So like I said, some introduced species, and we can treat cats as introduced, multiply very quickly. Cats can multiply, can breed very quickly, and become invasive. For example, in 1949, there were only 5 cats brought to Marion Island, a part of South Africa, and the cats were introduced, as usual, as pest control for mice. Cats hate mice, or hunt mice at least. But remember, 5 cats in 1949. By 1970, about 3,400 cats were living on the island and endangering dramatically the local bird population. And it's very common that it is very dangerous, especially on the islands. And the same thing happened to a famous Lyall's wren. Lyall's wren is this bird, unfortunately extinct already. It was first widespread in New Zealand, then it was only left in Stevens Island in New Zealand, and became extinct directly because of cats. Actually, because of humans that brought cats and let them roam free. The legend says it was because of one single cat named Tibbles, owned by a lighthouse keeper who was called Lyall, so this is why they were called Lyall's wrens. But probably there were several cats, and free roaming cats were direct and only reason of their total extinction of this bird. Free roaming cats are a serious problem. They are responsible for billions of, not mice deaths, of bird deaths, especially those small birds, quite often very rare birds. Well, cats tend to bring us presents, bring us gifts in form of dead birds. It is estimated that because of that they may have led already to extinction of 33 species. So once again, be careful, love your cats, and don't let your cats run free. Invasive species became, are already recognized as a big problem. I would like to show you, for instance, this website. It's INVASIVE.org. Well, you can see here that it's divided into some sections: plants, insects, diseases, and wildlife in general. I'd like to show you one thing, because it's a great source of knowledge about invasive species. Just let me share my screen. I'll just find, I'd like to just show you the scale of it. Okay, so this is it. I'm here in this, on this invasive.org website, and we have, I entered plants, and here you can see names of plants with family and so on and so on. You can also search them. But also I'd like to, plants is one thing, but I'd like to show you pathogens. Pathogens, and there are lots and lots of diseases that are invasive and can be very dangerous for some, for humans, but for livestock, for pets, for wildlife in general. So I invite you to look at invasive.org website. It's quite interesting. But let's go to other famous invaders rather than famous invasions. Zebra mussel. This species is originally native to the lakes of Eastern Europe, of Southern Russia, of Ukraine, and it's quite common in Poland, and nobody really treats it as a threat. But actually, nobody cared about its expansion until it arrived in the USA in 1980s. You can see how it's spread here, and these are those mussels, zebra mussels, quite nice. Why do they pose a problem? You can see it here. So they very adhesive, so they adhere to some surfaces. So first of all, they filter out, as any mussel, they filter out algae, but unfortunately they filter out algae that are native species that are needed for food for other species. And also they attach to some native mussels, they incapacitate those native mussels. But I think that from US perspective, the most important thing is that power plants must spend millions of dollars removing those zebra mussels from that are clogging some devices, water intakes, and so on and so on. So you can see that they adhere to ships, they adhere to lots of underwater devices. So this is a very serious economic problem, and zebra mussel, at least in the USA, is a very like an iconic invasive species. And this one, Heracleon sosnowski, I think that our Polish participants know it well because this one is iconic for Poland. Heracleon sosnowski, or Sosnowski hogweed, or in Polish barszcz Sosnowskiego, was introduced into Europe on purpose from Southwest Asia, first in the 19th century, and then in Poland it was sort of a gift from USSR, former Soviet Union. And it was introduced as a forage plant. It was growing very, very fast, sounds familiar, like an invasive species, and was supposed to feed cows effectively. And at present, it is widespread in many countries and belongs to the most invasive plant in the whole world. It's gigantic. I didn't find the photos, but once I was standing next to it, well, not too close to it because it is very dangerous. It can be taller than a human. And like I said, highly invasive and spreads very quickly thanks to this massive seed production. Often it grows in large groups, near rivers, near wet meadows. And why it's so dangerous? Well, first of all, it's eradicating everything around it, but also it's dangerous to humans because any contact between our skin and Sosnowski's hogweed results in painful burns, and in some cases it was even deadly. The victims are usually children fascinated by the plant and its enormous size, but this is a result. This is what happens when human skin comes in contact with hogweed. So adults often also fall prey of this weed's toxin. Often when they try to remove it themselves without proper protection or even proper training. In Poland, there are lots of programs of removing this weed, and it is advised to alert local authorities when you spot the weed's presence instead of attempting to get rid of them on your own, and it's extremely difficult to get rid of them on your own or get rid of them at all. It's a 5-year cycle of constant activities of removing, using herbicides, removing by hand, removing seeds, digging deep into the soil to remove those seeds, and it needs to be performed for 5 years at least because of the weed cycles to get rid of it completely. Another famous invader, especially famous now in Europe, in Poland, it makes even headlines of some tabloids, and in UK it's the same. It's harlequin ladybirds. They come from Asia. They look not very harmful. This is the variety of color forms that they can take, and they are the fastest spreading invasive species ever on record. They are the fastest. They are very dangerous for several reasons. First of all, they prey. They're cannibals, so they prey on native ladybirds. So as a result, our Polish, or in the UK or European two-spotted ladybirds population is declined by 30%. And in Poland, in UK, in other countries, maybe in your neighborhood too, recently it's a true invasion. You were not able to open your window without having like 50 harlequin ladybirds in the house. And they bite people. Unlike two-spotted ladybirds, they bite people. It's quite painful, and sometimes they can cause some allergic reactions, especially amongst children. And of course, as usual, there are different, also quite controversial point of views. So, is invasion always only bad? Well, in general, invasive species are very, very dangerous, and we need to consider them as a true danger to our crops, to the ecosystems, and so on. So they're like villains of conservation biology, because of the disruption of ecosystems. But in certain cases, they can be, and I emphasize, they can be quite beneficial. And some recent studies show that they are not always as bad. But I need to emphasize, there are only some cases that we need to look at. So pest control. I already mentioned that some of the now invasive species were brought in order to provide pest control, and sometimes it does work in certain cases. They're already here. They are very ferocious. They're good and predators. There's a lot of them, so they provide good pest control. Another thing I already mentioned as well is that most of our crops that we eat today, like wheat, like tomatoes or rice, were not native to our regions, but still benefit from them, and we cannot imagine that our lives without them. So after all, many of now beloved native creatures were once invasive. This is how biogeography works. For example, among them are dozens of honeybee species that were introduced, for example, to North America since the North America discovery, and especially since the 16th century. And people now worry mostly about those bees, honeybees, disappearing, not being invaders, because they were very, very beneficial as pollinators. So some researchers say that there is a variety of underappreciated roles that, like providing some ecosystem services like pest control, like also replenishing human damaged regions, like after mines, after intense industrial activity. When new species arrive, they can bring ecosystems to life. And generally, they're helping to sustain some balance of natural health when those ecosystems struggle to survive. Remember this horrible zebra mussel? I told you that they're filtering algae from the water, and that they're invasive for that, but also they filter toxins from lakes. So actually they bring in some good. So those researchers say that most ecosystems have been so vastly changed by human interventions already that returning them to the very original state is difficult or impossible. So many plant species have become rare. So maybe, and this is very controversial, it's time to create some new ecosystems based on those new invaders, new species. Here you can see the image of how new relations are formed in those ecosystems between native and non-native species. For example, it's honeysuckle. This plant is an invasive species, And they formed a new relationship with local bird population, and this relationship is mutually beneficial. So honeysuckle provides food for birds, and birds with their poo, with their feces, disperse seeds of the honeysuckle. So this is how nature finds its way for the balance. So if it's a question of forming new ecosystems, why do we even care? That maybe, well, for example, there's red fox and there's Arctic fox. Arctic fox is very cute, but if we can live actually without Arctic fox, why can we accept the fact that now we will have only red fox everywhere? Will our lives be so different? Well, it's all a question of biodiversity, and biodiversity understood in many contexts. So, first of all the species are interconnected, and you can see here. And if we disrupt any of those arrows, any of those relationships, the consequences can be unpredictable and really harmful. And it's a risk that no one is able to take. So they depend on one another. Forests providing homes for animals, animals eating plants, plants needing soil to grow, fungi helping to decompose organisms so the soil is fertilized, and so on and so on and so on. So if we have less of this richness, less of this biodiversity, these connections, these arrows weaken and sometimes they break, and this is harming all the species in the ecosystem. So biodiversity is important. It's important also to people in many ways. So starting from obvious, plants helping humans by giving oxygen, for example, food, shade, construction material, and so on and so on. So why do we care? What if there is only half of plants, half of species of plants that we know today? We can say that no one can name all of them, all of the species of plants anyway. So what's the point of keeping them all? Why are we worried that we're losing this biodiversity also because of invasive species? Once again, because most people, when think of biodiversity, when we say biodiversity, we think like Amazonian rainforest or coral reef in tropical seas. But actually, even our typical house in the suburbs, even the garden, is an amazing biodiversity of life, with its spiders, with its insects, with its amphibians, and moles and algae and fungi, and so on and so on. So non-scientists tend to understand biodiversity strictly like number of species found on Earth, but biologists find it as a variety of living organisms, like genetic variation and between populations and so on and so on. So in general, biodiversity or diversity provides with all those links, and the more the links there are, the stronger the ecosystem is. And with less links, with less diversity, ecosystems will become very vulnerable. And we cannot really predict the final effects. So if we know that invasive species are dangerous, are we just letting them go? No, we're trying to fight back. In many cases, we brought them ourselves as humans. For example, this Barsz Sosnowski hogweed, sorry. And now we're trying to fight back, but bringing them was easy, but fighting them is extremely difficult. We should focus on early detection, identifying what are their pathways, but often it's too late. We already have to eradicate those organisms that are already there. This plant here is golden road May. It's very, very invasive. It looks quite nice, but actually it's horribly difficult to get rid of. There are whole programs that people usually have to do it by hand because there's no other way. and year after year, again, like with Sosnowski hogweed, they need to eradicate them, and they just grow back in new places. So you can see here that there's invasive plants fighting, and those programs quite often have also some funding, some state governmental funding too. And I'd like to finish with our favorite topic, which is the Arctic. And is the Arctic also a subject of invasion of exotic species? Of course it is, and it's a very vulnerable ecosystem. Again, the reasons are the same, because of climate change, which is, as you know, very, very intense and has large effects, especially in the Arctic. There is no more isolation, no more climatic barriers, but also this there's more and more economic activity in the Arctic, like more tourism, more shipping. And shipping is one of the most dangerous pathways of arriving species, invasive species, especially into the Arctic. Why? Because I don't know if you're aware that maybe here. Shipping have water ballast, discharging water ballast. So they bring water from one region of the Earth to now and discharge it into, for example, an Arctic ocean. And this is how lots of invasive species are being flushed into the Arctic. And the less sea ice there is, the most intense shipping industry is. So sea ice melts, more shipping, and so on and so on. So the trend is expected to continue. And with discharging ballast, lots of marine creatures are brought. There was a special study in Svalbard, you know well, Svalbard, our regional Polish polar station, Hornsund. Researchers took samples of this ballast water released by ships coming into the port, and in those samples they identified 23 non-native species like crabs, like barnacles, copepods. So in one single ship. So you can imagine how enormous it is, and they can come from very exotic areas. So this crab, for example, is eating native species of shellfish and plankton and competing with native crabs, or even introducing new types of parasites, which is quite dangerous. So another example I already mentioned is a famous war of foxes, a war between a red fox and Arctic fox. Sorry, this photo is a little bit drastic, but it shows that red fox endangers populations of Arctic fox in many ways. So researchers started wondering, why is it that even though Arctic fox is protected in this area, in Arctic area and Arctic tundra, for more than 70 years, numbers of populations, number of organisms remained extremely low. So this lack of recovery is now thought to be because of the invasion of the red fox. So red fox, first of all, is larger than the Arctic fox and can outcompete Arctic foxes, simply hunting them, preying on them, but mostly competing with Arctic foxes for food sources, such as lemmings, on which Arctic foxes heavily rely. So they physically dominate, but they also eat their food. So populations of Arctic foxes are declining too, because of larger and stronger red fox. And I promise I'm coming to my final slides. The Arctic invasion takes place not only but mostly in the sea, within the world of marine organisms. Once again, with the ice retreating, there's, for example, Arctic cod. You know Arctic cod as one of the food resources that northern fisheries focused on. So Arctic cod likes temperatures below 4 Celsius degrees. So it's trying to north and north, even further north, and it causes a niche. And the new fish are filling in their niches, like capelin, also cod, but Atlantic or Pacific cod, and it is affecting fishery a lot and threatening traditional fishery. What you can see here is mackerel. Well, mackerel hasn't been seen for a long time, for example, around Iceland, but now it became so common. It usually likes warmer waters, but as water gets warmer in the north, it travels north. That people in the north, fishermen in the north, even began to fish mackerels, which is quite unusual for a long time. So this is it from me for today.